If you pull up a map of the world right now, like really look at it, you are effectively staring at a ghost.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we tend to think of national borders as these ancient, um, immovable facts of geography,
Yeah.
like mountains or rivers.
Right, like they've just always been there.
Exactly. But the reality, a massive chunk of the lines on that map were drawn in a very short, very volatile window of time by men in waistcoats standing around mahogany tables in Berlin or London.
Men who, in many cases, had never even set foot in the continents they were carving up. They were just drawing straight lines through deserts, jungles, existing kingdoms. They were completely changing the trajectory of millions of lives with basically a ruler and a pencil.
Precisely. Today, we are unpacking a massive slice of history in this deep dive. We're looking at European imperialism between 1815 and 1914. And before anyone tunes out thinking this is just dates and battles, this is actually the origin story of the modern world.
It really is.
This is the moment the global fuse was lit.
It's a massive topic. But our mission today is to cut through the noise. We have a stack of source material here. AP, European history analysis, diplomatic records, economic critiques, and we're going to move past the simple conquest narrative.
Right, the usual textbook stuff.
Yeah, we want to look at the consequences.
So what, essentially?
Exactly. We need to understand how this scramble for territory actually broke European diplomacy, how it sparked this fierce intellectual civil war back home, and crucially, how the rest of the world responded.
Because it wasn't a passive response.
Not at all. The choice for non-European nations was brutal. You either fight back and risk annihilation, or you modernize and try to beat Europe at its own game.
And we have some incredible stories in the sources to get us there.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about how a dispute over a railroad in the middle of a swamp almost started World War I 20 years early.
Oh, the Fashoda story.
Yeah, and how a simple camera helped take down a king.
That camera story is wild. It's essentially the birth of modern human rights campaigning.
So let's get into it. I want to start with the diplomatic side, the Europe versus Europe dynamic.
Okay.
Because I think there's a misconception that imperialism was just the West acting as a unified team against the rest of the world. But the source material paints a much messier picture.
Oh, it's definitely not a team sport.
No.
It was a free-for-all. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa had turned into this high-stakes game of geopolitical chess. You had Britain, France, Germany, Belgium. They're all rushing to claim territory.
Right.
But here is the key insight from the diplomatic records. The fear wasn't just that the indigenous populations would resist.
It was each other.
Yes. The real nightmare scenario for European leaders was that European powers would start shooting at each other over these colonies.
Which would trigger a continental war that nobody could afford.
Exactly.
And this context makes the Berlin Conference of 1884 make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It's often portrayed as just pure greed, which, it was, but there's a pragmatic, almost bureaucratic logic to it, wasn't there?
It was cold-blooded conflict resolution. Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, saw this competition heating up.
He was a very pragmatic guy.
Very. He looked at the map and realized that if Britain and France and Germany kept bumping into each other in Africa, the sparks would fly back to Europe. So he essentially blew the whistle and called a timeout.
Just pause the whole thing.
Right. He invited everyone to Berlin to set the ground rules for the game.
To regulate colonization. That's such a bureaucratic way to say, let's agree on who gets to steal what.
It really is.
I've always found the phrase effective occupation interesting in these AP notes. Can you break that down?
That was the critical rule they established at the conference. Before Berlin, you could just claim a coastline by planting a flag and sailing away.
Right, just leaving a piece of fabric.
Exactly. But at Berlin, they decided that to actually own a colony, you had to have effective occupation. Meaning administrators, soldiers, a police force actually on the ground.
So it forced them to speed up. You
Yeah.
couldn't just bluff anymore.
It hypercharged the whole process. It meant you had to rush troops in immediately to secure the claim. And the tragedy, of course, is that while they were drawing these lines based on longitude and latitude to keep the peace in Europe,
They were completely ignoring the reality on the ground in Africa.
completely,
Because no African leaders were invited to Berlin.
not a single one.
Wow.
So they split unified ethnic groups in half, or they forced historic rivals into the exact same administrative colony. When you look at civil wars or instability in the post-colonial world today, you can often trace the root cause directly back to a line drawn by a diplomat in Berlin in 1885 who was just trying to balance a ledger.
But from the European perspective, did it work? Did it stop them from fighting?
It acted as a pressure release valve. For a while, anyway. It prevented a major war in the 1880s, but it didn't stop the friction.
It just moved it.
Right, the competition just moved to the margins, deeper into the interior of the continent. And that brings us to the Fashoda crisis of 1898, which honestly plays out like a movie script.
I love this story because it's so petty, yet the stakes were basically apocalyptic. This is Britain versus France. Set the scene for us.
It's all about railroads. In the late 19th century, railroads were like the internet, or AI today. Whoever controlled the infrastructure controlled the future.
The ultimate tech.
Exactly. Britain had this massive romantic dream of a Cape to Cairo railway, a solid red line of British territory running north to south through the entire continent.
And France had a very different idea.
France wanted an east to west line, connecting their holdings from Senegal on the Atlantic all the way to Djibouti on the Red Sea. Now, if you visualize a map, a north-south line and an east-west line have to cross somewhere.
Basic geometry. They
Yeah.
can't both exist without intersecting.
And that somewhere was Fashoda. It was this dusty, swampy outpost on the Nile in modern-day Sudan.
A completely miserable place by all accounts.
Oh, terrible. You had a French expedition under Captain Marchal who had trekked for months across the desert, and a British flotilla under Lord Kitchener coming down the river. And they literally bumped into each other in the middle of nowhere.
I can just imagine the staring match.
It was a total standoff. Flags went up, ultimatums were sent back and forth.
And the press back home went crazy, right?
Yeah.
Because this wasn't kept secret.
It was jingoism at its absolute peak, this aggressive, warlike nationalism. The newspapers in London and Paris were screaming for war.
They wanted blood.
There were naval mobilizations. This could easily have been the start of World War I, right there in 1898, over a mud fort in the Sudan.
But, and here's the twist. France blinked. They backed down. Why?
They did the cold, hard math. The French diplomats realized that while they were arguing with Britain over a swamp in Sudan, their real existential threat was back in Europe, Germany. Germany's industrial and military power was exploding at this time. France realized, we cannot fight Britain in Africa and guard our border against Germany at the same time.
So they swallowed their pride.
They withdrew from Fashoda. But this is the crucial takeaway from the diplomatic sources. That moment didn't just prevent a war, it flipped the entire game board.
Because it led to an alliance.
Yes, the resolution of Fashoda led directly to the Entente Cordiale in 1904. Britain and France, who had been historic enemies for literally centuries.
Right. Think Joan of Arc, Napoleon.
Exactly. They decided to stop fighting over colonies and start cooperating against Germany.
Which I imagine didn't sit well with the Germans.
They were furious. They felt completely encircled. And this brings us to the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911.
Where Germany pushes back.
Right. Germany, specifically Kaiser Wilhelm II, wanted to test this new friendship between Britain and France to see if it was real or just paper.
Like the schoolyard bully trying to break up a new couple to see if they'll actually defend each other.
Perfectly put. Germany intervened in French-controlled Morocco. They made these aggressive speeches about Moroccan independence, back rebellions. They even sent a gunboat, the famous SMS Panther, to the port of Agadir.
Very subtle.
Right. The goal was to panic the French and make the British flake, proving the alliance was worthless.
But the gunboat diplomacy completely backfired.
Spectacularly. Instead of splitting them up, the bullying drove Britain and France closer together. They realized they actually needed each other. They started coordinating their navies, Britain guarding the Channel, France guarding the Mediterranean.
They have to get down.
By 1911, Europe was polarized into two armed camps. The Anglo-French alliance versus Germany and Austria. The colonial competition had blown back into Europe and set the stage for 1914.
It's so ironic. The colonies were supposed to be a place to expand without conflict, but they ended up cementing the alliances that created the biggest conflict in history.
That is the great tragedy of the era. The safety valve actually pressurized the tank.
Now, while the diplomats were playing Risk with the world map, I think there's a misconception that everyone back in Europe was cheering for empire. We kind of assume everyone in a top hat was an imperialist. But the sources suggest a pretty fierce debate was raging at home.
It wasn't a monolith. That's really important to highlight. There was a significant intellectual battle over whether imperialism was smart, profitable, or even moral. You had economists like J.A. Hobson who were incredibly critical.
What was Hobson's main beef with it? Was it a moral argument?
Surprisingly, it was mostly economic. Hobson looked at the ledgers and argued that imperialism was actually bad business for the nation as a whole. He called it a drag on healthy capitalism.
How so?
His theory was that the cost of maintaining colonies, the standing armies, the bureaucracy, the continuous border wars, far outweighed the actual trade
So who
benefits.
was making the money? Because someone was definitely getting rich.
A tiny elite. Arms manufacturers, shipping magnates, certain investors. Hobson argued the taxpayer footed the bill for the empire, paying for the army and the navy, while the profits went to the top 1%.
That sounds startlingly modern.
It does. He saw it as a massive redistribution of wealth from the public to the rich.
And then you have the more radical take from Vladimir Lenin. Now, looking at the sources impartially here, what was his economic critique?
Right. The sources outline that Lenin read Hobson and took the theory a step further. He argued that imperialism wasn't just a bad policy choice, it was the highest stage of capitalism.
The inevitable endpoint.
According to his argument, capitalist systems eventually run out of growth at home. They suffer from underconsumption. People literally can't buy all the stuff being made. So to prevent the domestic economy from collapsing, they have to aggressively seize new markets to dump their goods and grab cheap resources.
So for Lenin, war for territory wasn't a mistake. It was a required feature of the system.
Exactly. The source material shows he thought you couldn't have capitalism without imperialism and eventually war.
But surely there were people arguing for it. I see the Pan-German League mentioned in the notes.
Oh, absolutely. We have to be fair to the context of the time. The sources show the Pan-German League and groups like them in Britain and France viewed colonies as essential for national survival.
It wasn't just about the money for them.
It was about prestige. To them, if you didn't have an empire, you were in great power, you were lunch. They firmly believed in social Darwinism.
The survival of the fittest applied to countries.
Right. The idea that nations are in a biological struggle for existence and only the strongest expand.
So you have this economic debate on one side and this nationalist debate on the other. But then you have the human rights crisis.
Okay.
And this is where we have to talk about the Congo. This is arguably the darkest chapter in this entire stack of notes.
It is. The Congo Free State was unique because it wasn't a colony of a country initially. It was the personal, private property of King Leopold II of Belgium.
I still struggle to wrap my head around that. An entire country, massive scale, owned by one guy. Not Belgium, just Leopold.
And he ran it like a forced labor camp. The context here is the invention of the pneumatic tire. For bicycles and the very early automobiles, the world suddenly needed rubber.
And the Congo had wild rubber vines.
Yes. And Leopold extracted that rubber through a system of absolute terror. We're talking about hostage-taking, burning villages, and the infamous practice of severing the hands of workers who didn't meet their quotas.
It's horrific. But this is also where we see the birth of modern humanitarianism. Tell us about Edmund Morel.
Edmund Morel is a fascinating figure because he wasn't a politician or a diplomat. He was a shipping clerk in Liverpool. He worked for a company that did business with the Congo. And he started looking at the ledgers for the ships sitting right there at the docks.
The paperwork gave it away.
Yes. He noticed that the ships leaving Europe were full of guns, ammunition, and chains. But the ships coming back were full of rubber and ivory.
And nothing was going back to the Congolese. No trade goods, no payment.
Exactly. He realized just by looking at the books that this wasn't trade, it was slavery. He deduced the massive crime from the paperwork alone.
And they used a new technology to fight it. The Kodak camera.
This was the real game changer. The Congo Reform Association started circulating photographs. Missionaries like Alice Seeley Harris took photos of Congolese fathers looking at the severed hands of their children.
Just devastating images.
When these photos hit the newspapers and pamphlets in Europe and America, it shocked the public conscience.
It made the abstract idea of imperialism undeniable. You couldn't look away anymore.
It was the first time evidence of atrocities went viral, so to speak. It was so effective that public pressure forced the Belgian government to step in and strip Leopold of his personal control in 1908.
It shows that even at the height of empire, public opinion could still be weaponized against monarchs.
Truly.
And speaking of shifting vibes, we have to mention Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
A fictional book, but one that landed a heavy blow. Conrad showed the psychological and moral degradation of the colonizers. It challenged that whole civilizing mission narrative.
The idea that Europe was bringing light to the dark places.
Right. Conrad suggested that maybe the darkness was actually inside the Europeans.
Let's pivot now to the other side of the equation. We've talked about what Europe did and what Europe thought. But how did the rest of the world respond? Because the biggest myth is that non-European societies were just passive victims waiting to be conquered.
That is the most important correction to make. The response was incredibly dynamic. Broadly, you can put the responses into two baskets: resistance and modernization.
Let's start with resistance. The notes mention the Indian Congress Party, which feels like a very intellectual form of resistance.
It was, and there's a deep irony there. The Indian Congress Party was formed mostly by Western-educated lawyers and intellectuals. They learned English, they read Locke and Mill, and then they used those European concepts like liberty and self-determination to argue against British rule.
They threw the textbook right back at them.
They essentially held up a mirror to the British and said, "You taught us these values, now why don't you apply them to us?"
But there was also violent, kinetic resistance. The Sepoy Mutiny in 1857 seems like a turning point.
It was the moment the British almost lost India. The sepoys were Indian soldiers serving the British East India Company. The trigger was a rumor about rifle cartridges being greased with cow and pig fat, which was offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. But that was really just the spark.
The fuel was the deeper resentment.
Right. The fear of forced Christianization, the blatant disrespect for local culture, the constant takeover of local princely states. It exploded into a massive war.
And what was the outcome?
Britain eventually cried it, but it scared them so much that the British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. It shifted from corporate rule to state rule, beginning the Raj.
We see a similar pattern of bravery versus technology with the Zulus in South Africa.
The Zulus are a tragic example of a highly sophisticated military tradition hitting the absolute wall of the Industrial Revolution. They raised an army of 40,000 men to defend their land, and specifically the new diamond mines that the British wanted.
And they actually won early on, right?
They did. They wiped out a British column at Isandlwana.
But they couldn't sustain it.
No. You can have all the courage and strategy in the world, but if the other side has Gatling guns and modern artillery, and you have spears and muskets, the math is against you.
The technology gap was just too wide.
We saw the same thing in China with the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were a secret society that wanted to expel all foreigners and Christians. They fought incredibly hard, but an international coalition of basically every imperial power teamed up to crush them.
So if fighting head-on usually failed due to that technology gap, what was the other option? You mentioned modernization.
Strategy B: if you can't beat them, become them. And the star example here is Japan.
The Meiji Restoration.
Correct. Japan looked at what was happening to China, how it was being carved up into spheres of influence by Europeans, and they said, not us. They launched a top-to-bottom revolution.
It changed everything.
They centralized the government, they built factories, they adopted Western military drills, they even changed the way they dressed.
They downloaded the Imperial Power Operating System.
And ran it better than the Europeans. Japan didn't just avoid being colonized. They became an imperial power themselves.
By defeating a European power.
Yes. They defeated Russia in 1905. That sent shockwaves through the entire world. An Asian power defeating a European great power. It completely shattered the myth of white supremacy in warfare. It proved that global power was about industrial capacity, not race.
But my absolute favorite story in this stack of sources is Ethiopia. Because they didn't just modernize structurally. They played the Europeans at their own diplomatic game.
King Menelik II, he is a brilliant strategic figure. He knew that the only thing separating him from defeat was firepower. So while the European diplomats were talking, he was shopping.
Shopping for guns.
Industrial-grade weapons, and he played the European powers against each other masterfully. He bought rifles and artillery from France and Russia, who were more than happy to annoy the Italians.
Because Italy was eyeing Ethiopia.
Right. So when Italy decided to invade Ethiopia in 1896, thinking it would be an easy walkover against a primitive African army, they walked right into a buzzsaw.
The Battle of Adwa.
The Ethiopians had the same guns the Italians did, and they had way more of them. Ethiopia crushed the Italian army.
Incredible.
It was a humiliating defeat for Italy, and it kept Ethiopia independent. It proved that the superiority of Europe wasn't about biology or culture or religion. It was strictly about technology. If you leveled the playing field, the outcome changed completely.
So let's try to synthesize all of this. We've got diplomatic crises, moral reckonings, and global resistance. If we zoom out, what is the legacy here? Why does this matter to you listening today?
If you want to understand the 20th century or even the headlines today, you have to understand this period. Imperialism did three fundamental things. First, it redrew the global map in a way that completely ignored human geography, creating the border conflicts we are still solving today in the Middle East and Africa.
Second,
Second, it created the rigid alliance systems, Britain and France hugging close to protect their colonies from Germany. That made World War I inevitable. You can draw a straight line from the swamp in Fashoda to the trenches of the Somme.
And the third,
Third, it proved that industrial technology was the new deciding factor in global power, sparking a massive arms race that really hasn't stopped since.
it's heavy stuff. And here's the provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We talked about how the scramble for Africa was, in part, an attempt by European powers to expand without fighting each other, a way to compete peacefully.
A safety valve, a way to let off steam without destroying Europe.
Exactly. But if that's true, is it fair to say that the colonization of the Global South was essentially a way for Europe to export its own aggression? That the suffering of millions of people in Africa and Asia was collateral damage in a European family feud that they couldn't resolve at home?
Wow.
And when they finally ran out of land to steal, the safety valve burst, and the war came home to Europe in 1914 anyway.
That is a haunting question. And when you look at how quickly the colonial disputes turned into the trenches of World War I, the answer might just be yes. The violence they exported eventually came back to haunt them.
Something to think about next time you look at a map. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.